The traffic stop. The early afternoon sun hung high over Atlanta, casting a golden hue across the bustling streets. People moved about, cars zoomed past, and life in the city carried on as usual. But in the parking lot of one busy grocery store, the mood was anything but ordinary. Tension brewed, thick and heavy, as the scene unfolded near a sleek black Mercedes. Standing tall, his hand dangerously close to his holstered gun, Officer Derek Mathers demanded in a sharp, authoritative voice, "Excuse me, ma'am." "Step out of the vehicle." Heads turned. Shoppers paused mid-step. Some subtly pulled out their phones, sensing something about to happen. The officer's words sliced through the ambient sounds, commanding attention. But the woman in the driver's seat of the Mercedes, an elegant, composed African-American in her late 30s, didn't flinch. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly, but her gaze remained calm, confident. She had been through this before. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Nia Robinson asked, her voice steady, carrying a hint of irritation beneath its polished surface. Officer Mathers, known for his aggressive tactics and the unsettling power trip that came with his badge, sneered at her from behind his mirrored sunglasses. To him, this was not just another routine traffic stop. It was an opportunity to flex the authority he so often wielded with little regard for the consequences. And here was this woman, driving a car he decided she shouldn't be able to afford, her confidence suggesting she wasn't one to be intimidated. "License and registration," he barked, his tone flat, devoid of the courtesy he occasionally extended to other drivers. He didn't explain why he had pulled her over, didn't offer any pleasantries. He didn't have to, in his mind. Nia's face remained composed as she reached into her designer handbag, pulling out the requested documents. As she handed them over, her calm demeanor never faltered, but a quiet storm brewed behind her eyes. She had encountered officers like Mathers before, men who saw her skin color and her success as incompatible, men who thrived on belittling people like her. She had tolerated it too many times, but today was different. "Here you go, officer," Nia said, her voice carrying a subtle edge. She wasn't about to cower. Not today. Mathers grabbed the documents from her hand without a word of thanks, glancing down at her name on the license, Nia Robinson. He didn't recognize it, though it was a name that carried significant weight in certain circles, legal circles in particular. But to Officer Mathers, she was just another black woman behind the wheel of an expensive car, a situation that in his mind automatically warranted suspicion. "Where are you headed, Miss Robinson?" he asked, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain as he glanced over the sleek vehicle once more. To him, it was far too nice for someone like her. Nia's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I'm on my way home from work," she replied, the words clipped, polite, but firm. Mathers leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing behind his shades. He couldn't hide the sneer that curled his lips as he shot a condescending glance toward the interior of her car. "Work, huh?" In a car like this, his tone was unmistakable. It was the kind of disdain that was sharpened over years of unchecked authority, a deeply ingrained arrogance that allowed him to believe that he had the right to question her success. Nia's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, though her heart pounded beneath her calm exterior. "Yes, officer," she said, her voice cool. "I'm a lawyer." The word hung in the air for a moment. It was a simple declaration, but one that carried the weight of countless hours of hard work, of late nights in the office, of courtroom battles fought and won. But Mathers, stubborn in his own ignorance, wasn't impressed. If anything, the mention of her profession seemed to harden the smug expression on his face. "A lawyer, huh?" he repeated, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "And what firm do you work for, Miss Robinson?" Nia didn't miss the sneer, the way her name rolled off his tongue like an insult. But instead of responding with anger, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of warmth, nor one of amusement. It was the smile of a woman who knew exactly where this interaction was headed and exactly how it was going to end. "You'll find out soon enough, officer." Mathers bristled at the subtle challenge in her words. He wasn't used to people, especially not women like Nia, talking back to him. His position was one of authority, and in his experience, most people cowered when faced with it. They stammered, they complied, they shrank back. But this woman wasn't giving him the satisfaction of fear. His pulse quickened, anger flickering just beneath the surface. His ego, already bruised by the fact that she wasn't submitting to his unspoken dominance, demanded that he escalate. Without another word, he stepped back and gestured sharply. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice a little louder, a little sharper. Nia's eyes darkened at the escalation. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with the knowledge that this very moment, was where things often took a turn for the worse. She had studied too many cases like this, had witnessed too many videos of traffic stops that had spiraled into something much darker. But Nia wasn't just any woman, and this wasn't going to go the way Officer Mathers expected. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, her posture tall, her head held high. Her heels clicked against the asphalt, the sound echoing through the now eerily quiet parking lot. By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A few people held their phones up, recording the interaction. Everyone could feel it. The simmering tension that hung heavy in the air, waiting to boil over. "Hands on the hood," Mathers barked, his hand twitching near his belt as if preparing for the worst. Nia raised an eyebrow, her expression incredulous. "What for?" she asked, her voice cool but sharp. "Am I under arrest?" "Just do as I say," Mathers growled, the anger in his voice unmistakable now. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Nia, however, stood her ground. "Officer," she said, her voice strong, unwavering, "unless you're formally arresting me, I have no obligation to comply with your illegal request." Mathers' face flushed a deep red. His hand hovered dangerously close to her arm, but before he could make another move, Nia spoke again. This time, her voice cut through the tension like a knife, clear and cold. "Officer Mathers, I'd advise you to think very carefully about your next move," she said, her words sharp with authority. "Because the moment you touch me without cause, you'll be violating my constitutional rights. And trust me, I know exactly how to handle that in court." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to make a mistake. Mathers froze, his hand inches from her arm. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Nia's voice dropped to a deadly calm as she continued. "I'm not just any lawyer. I specialize in civil rights. And I've taken down officers like you before. So if you want to escalate this, by all means, go ahead. But I guarantee you'll regret it." The power dynamics had shifted, and Mathers knew it. The tension was no longer under his control. It belonged to Nia now. The moment of reckoning. The crowd in the parking lot had swelled by the time Nia finished speaking, her words slicing through the air with a cold precision that left Officer Derek Mathers momentarily speechless. His hand, still hovering near her arm, trembled slightly. He had faced plenty of unruly citizens in his decade on the force, and had handled more than his share of confrontations. But there was something different about this woman, about Nia Robinson, that threw him off balance. The confidence in her posture, the calm defiance in her eyes, and the authority in her voice suggested she wasn't someone he could simply push around. And now, with more eyes on him than he cared to acknowledge, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Nia stood firm, her gaze never wavering from Mathers' face. She knew exactly what was happening in his mind. He wasn't just facing her anymore. He was facing the judgment of every person who had stopped to watch, every phone raised to record the unfolding drama. And perhaps for the first time in his career, he couldn't rely on his badge to protect him from the consequences of his actions. He couldn't hide behind the authority it gave him. not with the threat of exposure looming large over his shoulder. As the minutes stretched, Mathers shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his face a mixture of anger and uncertainty. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into him. He had been here before, caught in a moment where his pride urged him to escalate, to assert dominance, but something held him back this time. A small voice in the back of his mind warned him of the dangers of going too far. "You're resisting an officer, Miss Robinson," Mathers finally said, his voice quieter, but still laced with frustration. "I'm just doing my job." Nia's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Resisting? For asking you a simple question. Officer, you need to understand something very clearly. Your badge does not give you the right to treat me, or anyone else, like a criminal without cause. I have done nothing wrong, and you have no grounds to detain me. Now, unless you want this to escalate into something far more damaging for your career, I suggest you let me go on my way." Her words struck him hard, as though she had just pulled the rug out from beneath him. He had expected resistance, expected the usual stammering or fear from someone confronted by his authority. But Nia was different. She spoke with the precision of someone well-versed in legal matters, someone who knew the full weight of the law and wasn't afraid to use it. More than that, Nia knew the power of perception. She had spent years studying the subtleties of how the law played out in public, and she knew that the tide had turned in her favor the moment the cameras came out. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a spectacle, one that could easily spiral into a viral moment if handled poorly by Mathers. And Mathers could feel that shift, too. It was subtle, but undeniable. The whispers in the crowd had grown louder, and the bystanders were no longer passive onlookers. They had become active participants, their phones capturing every movement, every word. The tension in the air was palpable, a dangerous cocktail of anticipation and anger. Mathers could feel it building, rising like a wave that threatened to sweep him under if he didn't act quickly. But what could he do? His instincts screamed at him to arrest her, to assert control over the situation, but the rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to navigate the fine line between authority and overreach, warned him that this was no ordinary stop. He was in unfamiliar territory, facing a woman who had the legal knowledge to back up her defiance and the confidence to challenge him in front of a growing crowd. The cameras, the onlookers, the unshakable calm on Nia's face. It was all too much. For a brief moment, Mathers considered his options. He could still arrest her, though now, with the crowd's attention fully on him, it would likely lead to a situation spiraling out of control. He could call for backup, but even that might not save him from the public outcry that was already building in the parking lot. His career, once seemingly untouchable, now felt precariously balanced on the edge of a knife. As he stood there, lost in thought, a murmur rippled through the crowd. From the corner of his eye, Mathers saw a man stepping forward, his expression determined. He was middle-aged, his work uniform marked with the grease stains of a long shift at a local factory. His face was weathered, lined with years of hard work and long days, but his eyes burned with a quiet resolve. "Hey, officer," the man called out, his voice firm, but measured. "What's going on here? Why are you harassing this woman?" Mathers snapped his head around, his gaze hardening as he met the man's eyes. "This doesn't concern you," he growled, the tension in his voice betraying his fraying control. But the man didn't back down. "It concerns all of us when we see something like this," he said, his voice growing louder as he gestured toward Nia. "She hasn't done anything wrong, and you're treating her like a criminal. What's your reason, officer?" Mathers' jaw clenched. He could feel the crowd beginning to shift, their energy turning against him. It wasn't just Nia he was dealing with now. It was the collective frustration of every person watching, every person who had seen or experienced this kind of injustice before. The parking lot, once a place of mundane errands and casual conversations, had become a powder keg of social tensions, ready to explode at any moment. "I'm handling this," Mathers snapped, trying to regain control. Step back." But the man wasn't intimidated. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing his ground. "No, you're not. You're bullying this woman because you think you can get away with it. We all see what's happening here." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. The energy shifted again, this time more visibly. People stepped closer, their phones raised higher, and the murmurs of discontent grew louder. It was no longer just a confrontation between Naya and Officer Mathers. It had become a public spectacle, a moment that echoed the larger tensions between law enforcement and the communities they were sworn to protect. Naya stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a calm that belied the storm brewing within her. She had seen this before, had witnessed firsthand the way power dynamics shifted in moments like this. It was no longer just about her rights being violated. This was now about something much bigger. And she wasn't going to let it end quietly. Officer Mathers, still holding Nia's license and registration, shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the pressure mounting, could hear the voices in the crowd rising in anger. His radio crackled at his side, and for a brief second, he considered calling for backup again. But he knew it would only draw more attention, would only escalate things further. He was trapped, boxed in by his own actions, by his own need to assert control over a situation that had long since spiraled out of his hands. Before he could say anything, the piercing wail of a police siren cut through the air. Mathers turned to see another squad car pulling into the parking lot, its lights flashing brightly against the backdrop of the sunny afternoon. His heart sank. Officer Daniels, a senior officer and Mathers' direct superior, stepped out of the squad car with a heavy sigh. He had seen the crowd, had heard the chatter over the police radio, and knew immediately what kind of situation he was walking into. And with Mathers at the center of it, it was bound to be a mess. Daniels was a seasoned officer, one who had spent decades walking the same streets as Mathers, but he had learned to navigate the delicate balance between enforcing the law and respecting the community. He wasn't perfect. No officer was, but he understood the power of perception, the importance of de-escalation, and from the looks of things, Mathers had let this situation escalate far beyond what was necessary. "Direk," Daniels called as he approached, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Mathers, still flushed with frustration and uncertainty, gestured toward Nia. "She's been resisting, Lieutenant," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I'm just doing my job." Daniels paused, his gaze shifting from Mathers to Nia, and then to the crowd that had gathered around them. He could feel the tension in the air, could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface of every face in the crowd. He knew that one wrong move could turn this situation from a confrontation into a full-blown incident. He also knew that Nia wasn't just any woman. Daniel's eyes met Nia's, and in that brief moment, he recognized the calm power she held, the quiet defiance in her stance. She wasn't afraid, and she wasn't backing down. This wasn't going to be resolved with the usual show of force. "I'll take it from here, Direk," Daniel said quietly, his voice measured. He placed a hand on Mathers' shoulder, pulling him aside. "Go back to the car." "But, Lieutenant," Mathers began, his frustration boiling over. Daniels cut him off with a sharp look. "Direk, you're making the scene. Do you even know who this is?" Mathers hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't care who she is." He spat. "She was resisting, that's all that matters." Daniel shook his head, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "No, Direk, that's not all that matters. Not anymore." Unmasking the truth. Officer Daniels' words hung in the air, carrying a weight that visibly settled over the crowd. The situation had reached a tipping point, and it was clear that whatever happened next would determine the direction of this volatile encounter. The atmosphere was charged with tension, every second feeling like a slow burn as the drama unfolded. The crowd, no longer just passive observers, now leaned in, their collective gaze fixed on Officer Mathers, whose face flushed with frustration. Daniel stepped forward, trying to diffuse the situation with the steady, practiced calm of an officer who had seen far too many moments like this go sideways. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just about diffusing a tense encounter. This was about the public's perception of justice, fairness, and the delicate relationship between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to serve. Nia stood her ground, her posture unwavering, her face calm and composed. She wasn't just waiting for the next move. She was preparing for it. In her mind, the pieces were already falling into place. The officer's humiliation, the public outrage, the viral videos, all of it would culminate in one undeniable fact. Derek Mathers had crossed a line, and she was going to make sure he knew exactly who she was before the day was over. Daniels gestured toward the crowd with a subtle wave, silently imploring them to give him space to work. He was aware of the growing mass of phones pointed at him, capturing his every move, every word. His training had prepared him for tense moments, but this was different. The public scrutiny wasn't just a background presence. It was a full-blown trial happening in real time. And Daniels knew that any misstep would be broadcast, dissected, and judged before the day was over. He turned to Nia, his eyes scanning her with the respect and curiosity of someone who could sense that she was no ordinary civilian. "Miss Robinson," he said, his voice measured, "can we talk for a moment?" Nia's eyes flicked toward Daniels, her gaze sharp but not hostile. "Talk," she echoed, her voice calm but firm. "Sure, but I'm not leaving until Officer Mathers explains why I was pulled over in the first place." Mathers, standing a few feet away, bristled at her words. His fists clenched at his sides, his temper visibly fraying at the edges. Daniels noticed the shift and shot him a warning glance, silently reminding him that he wasn't in control of this situation anymore. Daniels sighed, running a hand over his face before turning back to Nia. "Let's take this step by step," he said carefully. "I'm sure we can figure this out without escalating things any further." Nia crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze never leaving Mathers. "You're right, Lieutenant. We can figure this out. But I want answers. Why was I pulled over? Why did Officer Mathers feel the need to treat me like a criminal without cause?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He knew the answer to that question, even if Mathers wouldn't admit it. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with a situation like this, an officer pulling over someone they deemed suspicious simply because of the color of their skin or the car they were driving. It was an ugly truth that had plagued the force for years, and one that Daniels had grown weary of confronting. But Nia wasn't going to let it slide. Not today. "I understand your frustration, Miss Robinson," Daniels said carefully, trying to walk the tightrope between empathy and authority. "But let's get through this calmly. Officer Mathers was conducting a routine traffic stop. If there's been any misunderstanding, I'll make sure we clear it up." Nia's jaw tightened. A routine traffic stop. That was the excuse they always used, the veil they threw over blatant harassment to make it seem like a simple misunderstanding. But Nia wasn't some random civilian who could be brushed aside with a platitude. She was a lawyer, and she had built her career on unmasking these very lies. "Routine," she repeated, her voice cutting through the pretense. "Lieutenant Daniels, this isn't about a routine stop. This is about Officer Mathers seeing a black woman driving an expensive car and assuming she doesn't belong in it. This is about profiling, plain and simple." The crowd murmured in agreement, the words resonating with too many people who had faced similar situations. Nia's voice had become the voice of the people standing behind her, and Daniels could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about Nia anymore. This was about all of them. This was about the years of mistrust, the countless stories of traffic stops that had escalated into something far worse, and the simmering rage of a community that had been pushed too far, too many times. Daniels glanced back at Mathers, whose face had gone pale. The arrogant smirk that had once dominated his features was now replaced by a look of discomfort, as if the weight of his actions was slowly dawning on him. But Daniels knew Mathers wouldn't back down without a fight. He had worked with him for long enough to know that his pride and ego would drive him to dig his heels in, even in the face of undeniable evidence. But Nia wasn't finished. Her voice, calm yet powerful, sliced through the mounting tension. Officer Mathers pulled me over because he saw me as a threat. She continued, her words clear and deliberate. Not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. And that's why we're standing here right now. Mathers opened his mouth to respond, but Daniels held up a hand, silencing him before he could dig himself deeper into the hole he was already in. Miss Robinson, Daniels began, choosing his words carefully. I'm not here to defend anyone's actions. I'm here to make sure this situation doesn't escalate further. I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. But can we please move this to the side so we can address it properly? Standing here in the middle of the parking lot isn't going to help anyone. Nia studied Daniels for a moment, her eyes searching for any sign of condescension, any hint that he was trying to sweep this under the rug. But to his credit, Daniels seemed genuine. His tone wasn't patronizing, and there was no arrogance in his demeanor. He was simply a man caught in a difficult position, trying to navigate the situation as best he could. But Nia knew that, genuine or not, she couldn't let this go unchallenged. Not after what had happened. She had seen too many cases where situations like this had been brushed aside with a quick apology and a promise of an internal investigation that led nowhere. She wasn't going to let that happen here. Not this time. Lieutenant, she said, her voice soft but unyielding, I'm willing to move this conversation, but only after Officer Mathers explains why I was pulled over in the first place. I think I'm owed that explanation. Daniels nodded, though he could see Mathers shifting uncomfortably behind him. He knew his subordinate wasn't prepared to explain his actions in front of a crowd, especially not with all the phones still pointed at him. But Daniels also knew that if they didn't address it here and now, the situation would only get worse. The crowd wouldn't leave until they saw some kind of resolution, and Mathers' continued silence would only fuel their anger. Turning toward Mathers, Daniels gestured for him to step forward. Direct, he said quietly. I think it's time you explain yourself. Mathers' face flushed with frustration. He had always prided himself on his ability to control a situation, to assert his authority without question. But now, standing in front of a growing crowd of angry bystanders, his arrogance was faltering. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, could hear their mutters of disapproval, and it unnerved him. I pulled her over for a routine check, Mathers muttered, barely loud enough for the crowd to hear. She was driving erratically. The words landed with a hollow thud. The crowd wasn't buying it, and neither was Nia. Erratically, Nia scoffed, her voice filled with incredulity. I was driving in a straight line, officer. There was nothing erratic about it. And you know it. Mathers' jaw clenched, but he said nothing in response. Daniels stepped in, sensing that Mathers was about to lose whatever fragile control he had left. Miss Robinson, Daniels said gently, I understand your frustration, and I assure you we will look into this matter. But for now, let's move this off the street. We can file a formal complaint, and we'll address it through the proper channels. Nia's eyes narrowed. She had heard that line before. The promise of a formal complaint that would inevitably get lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. She knew how these things worked. But she also knew that Daniels was offering her a way out of the public spectacle without backing down. The crowd, however, wasn't as patient. A voice from the back shouted, We've seen this before. They're just gonna sweep it under the rug. Another person chimed in, Yeah, how many times have we heard that? Daniels could feel the tension rising again, the frustration and anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He needed to defuse this situation quickly, or it was going to spiral out of control. But before he could say another word, Nia raised her hand, silencing the crowd. She turned to Daniels. The shift in power. Nia's raised hand brought an instant hush over the restless crowd. The growing frustration and discontent had been held at bay by her quiet authority, a power that radiated not from any badge or title, but from the strength of her presence. The crowd, now merely 100 strong, trusted her instincts. They saw in Nia someone who wasn't afraid, someone who wasn't going to let the system silence her like so many others before her. As she lowered her hand, her gaze shifted back to Officer Daniels, her calm composure masking the fire that burned inside her. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Lieutenant Daniels," she began, her voice steady and deliberate. "I'm not naive. I've seen this kind of situation play out time and time again. A formal complaint filed, only to vanish into a bureaucratic black hole. A quiet slap on the wrist for the officer involved, and then everything goes back to business as usual. That's not going to happen today." Her words rang out like a challenge, not just to Daniels and Mathers, but to the entire system that had failed so many people who looked like her. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faith in the system long since eroded. For years, they had watched these same scenes unfold over and over again. Unjust stops, brutal arrests, and then nothing. But today, they sensed something different. Today, they were watching someone who wasn't willing to let things slip quietly into obscurity. Daniels shifted his stance, glancing briefly at Mathers, who still stood a few paces behind him, seething in silence. Mathers' once arrogant demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a mix of frustration and fear. His eyes darted nervously toward the crowd, and then back to Daniels, as if silently pleading for a way out of this nightmare. Daniels, to his credit, remained calm, though it was clear that he too was feeling the pressure. His voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that suggested he understood the gravity of the moment. "Miss Robinson, I assure you, we take complaints like this very seriously, but we need to go through the proper channels. This isn't the place for—" "This is exactly the place for it," Nia interrupted, her tone sharp. "This isn't just about me, Lieutenant. This is about everyone standing here, watching. How many times have they been pulled over for no reason? How many times have they been harassed, humiliated, and then ignored when they tried to speak out?" Her words hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right. He had seen the complaints come through the system, had watched as officers like Mathers were protected by a web of internal reviews and fake reports. And while he didn't personally condone the behavior, he had been complicit in the silence. He had seen the larger machine at work, and it was a machine designed to protect its own, not the public. The crowd was restless again, their anger simmering just below the surface. Nia could feel it, could hear it in the low murmurs, and see it in the faces around her. But this wasn't a mob. This was a community, one that had been pushed to the brink too many times. They were tired of being polite, tired of waiting for justice that never seemed to come. Nia took a step forward, her eyes locked on Daniels. "If you want to avoid escalating this further, then I suggest you start by holding Officer Mathers accountable, right here and now." Mathers, who had been silent for most of the confrontation, finally snapped. His face flushed red with anger, and he took a step forward, pointing a finger at Nia. "I'm not accountable to you." He spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I was doing my job. You were resisting an officer. You think because you are some high-powered lawyer that you can talk down to me." Nia didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze piercing through Mathers' outburst with a cold, unflinching stare. "I wasn't resisting anything, Officer Mathers. I was asserting my rights, rights that you seem to think don't apply to me because of the color of my skin." Mathers opened his mouth to argue, but Nia didn't give him the chance. "And that's why we're standing here right now, in front of all these people. Because they've seen it too. They've lived it. You look at me, and you see a threat. Not because of anything I've done, but because I don't fit into the box you've put me in." Daniel stepped between them, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, though it was clear he was struggling to maintain control. All right, he said quickly, his eyes darting between Nia and Mathers. "Let's take a step back here." But it was too late. The dam had already broken. Mathers was too far gone to rein in his anger, and the crowd was growing more restless by the second. They had seen enough, heard enough. Their patience was wearing thin. A voice from the crowd shouted, "You tell him, Nia, we've had enough of this. Another voice chimed in. It's time to hold these cops accountable. Daniel's face paled slightly as the crowd's anger shifted from a simmer to a boil. He had been in situations like this before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop. This was about years of pent-up frustration, years of systemic injustice bubbling to the surface in a single volatile moment. Nia, however, remained calm, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had from the beginning. "Lieutenant Daniels," she said, her tone measured but firm, "this isn't just going away. I'm not going away. And these people aren't going away. We need more than promises and proper channels. We need real accountability." Daniels could feel the weight of her words, the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. He had always prided himself on being a reasonable man, a fair officer who understood the importance of community relations. But this was different. This was the kind of situation that could ruin careers, the kind of situation that could spark something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. He swallowed hard, turning to face Mathers. "Derek," he said quietly, "I think you need to step back." Mathers blinked in surprise, his face contorting with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What?" he spat. "You're siding with her." Daniel's voice was firm but calm. "This isn't about sides, Derek. This is about de-escalating the situation before it gets worse. You've done enough." Mathers took a step forward, his body trembling with barely contained rage. "I did nothing wrong," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "She's the one who's resisting. She's the one who thinks she's above the law." Daniels held up his hand, his expression hardening. "Derek, that's enough. You're off this call. Go back to the car." Mathers' eyes blazed with fury, but he knew better than to argue with his superior in front of a crowd. With one last, venomous glare in Nia's direction, he turned and stalked back toward the squad car, his posture rigid with anger. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in celebration of what they saw as a small victory. But Nia didn't join in. She wasn't here for small victories. She was here for justice. Daniels, now standing alone with Nia in the center of the crowd, took a deep breath. "Miss Robinson," he said, his voice quieter now, "I want to help. But you have to understand, this is a process. We can't fix everything in one day." Nia met his gaze, her eyes sharp. "No, we can't," she agreed. "But we can start by holding people accountable. If you want to help, then don't just brush this aside. File the report. Make sure it doesn't disappear. And make sure Officer Mathers faces the consequences of his actions." Daniels nodded slowly, though he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The system wasn't built for quick justice. It was built for slow, methodical bureaucracy, designed to protect officers like Mathers from public scrutiny. But he also knew that this moment was different. Nia wasn't going to let this go quietly, and the crowd behind her wasn't going to forget what they had witnessed. "I'll make sure the report is filed," Daniels said finally, his voice low but sincere. "And I'll personally follow up to ensure it doesn't get buried." Nia didn't smile, but she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't enough, she knew that, but it was a start. And for now, a start was all she needed. As Daniels began to turn away, Nia's voice stopped him. "Lieutenant," she called, her tone soft but laced with steel. "Make sure Mathers knows my name, because this isn't the last time you'll hear it." Daniels paused, then nodded once before walking back toward the squad car, where Mathers sat, fuming in silence. The crowd began to disperse, the tension in the air slowly dissolving as people realized the confrontation was over. But as they left, they didn't just walk away from the scene. They carried with them a sense of something larger, something unfinished. This wasn't just about Nia Robinson. This was about all of them. Nia stood alone for a moment, watching as the crowd thinned out, her mind already turning to the next steps. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. As she climbed back into her car, Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Picking it up, she saw a flurry of messages, notifications, and missed calls. Word had already spread. Videos of the encounter were already circulating on social media, and her name was trending. Nia took a deep breath. This was exactly what she had planned for. The real fight was just beginning. The fallout. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Nia Robinson arrived home, the golden hues of the fading day casting long shadows across the streets of Atlanta. She pulled her Mercedes into the driveway of her modern, modestly elegant home, her mind still replaying the events of the afternoon. The hum of the engine stopped, but her thoughts continued to race. She hadn't expected the day to unfold quite like it had. But then again, nothing about these kinds of encounters was ever predictable. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, her phone still buzzing in her lap with notifications, texts, emails, calls, all from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had witnessed the scene unfold online. Word had spread quickly, far faster than she anticipated. By the time she had left the parking lot, the videos recorded by onlookers had already made their way to Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, sparking a viral moment that would soon take on a life of its own. Nia picked up her phone and scrolled through the flood of messages. The top one was from her best friend, Kayla, a fellow civil rights attorney. Kayla, girl, you blew up the internet. Have you seen the news? Nia sighed, shaking her head. Of course it was already on the news. She hadn't even had time to process the event herself, and now the world was dissecting it, turning it into hashtags, soundbites, and fuel for debates about policing, race, and justice in America. Another message came through, this time from her mentor, Judge Henrietta Davis, a formidable woman who had paved the way for black female lawyers like Nia to thrive in spaces that were traditionally hostile to them. Judge Davis, I'm proud of you, Nia. Call me when you have a moment. We need to talk about what's next. That last line hit Nia hard. What's next? She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The confrontation with Officer Mathers had been just the beginning, a single spark that now threatened to ignite a much larger firestorm. There would be consequences, not just for Mathers, but for Nia too. She knew all too well how the system reacted when people like her, people of color, particularly women, stood up and fought back. The backlash could be swift and unforgiving. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. It was Kayla, calling this time. Nia answered, her voice tired but steady. Hey, girl, what the hell happened? I mean, I know what happened. I saw the video. But damn, Nia, you took that man down. Nia let out a small laugh, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't take him down, Kayla. Not yet, anyway. He's probably sitting at home right now, telling himself he did nothing wrong. Kayla's voice softened, a note of concern creeping in. You okay, though? I mean, I know you handled it like a boss, but that was intense. Nia sighed, leaning her head back against the car seat. I'm fine. Really. It's not the first time I've dealt with this, and it won't be the last. But this time is different, Kayla pressed. This time, the whole world saw it. Nia knew Kayla was right. The situation had escalated far beyond the immediate parking lot confrontation. The videos had already racked up thousands of views, and social media was ablaze with outrage, praise, and, as always, plenty of criticism. The comments were a mix of support for Nia and vitriol from those who accused her of provoking the situation, of being another angry black woman causing unnecessary drama. Yeah, it's different, Nia admitted, but that doesn't mean it's going to be any easier. What are you going to do? Kayla asked. I know you, Nia. You're not just going to let this fade away. Nia paused, staring out at the fading sunlight. No, I'm not. Mathers needs to be held accountable, not just for what he did to me, but for what he's probably done to others. I'm going to make sure of it. But I'm going to need help. This isn't a one-woman fight. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Kayla's voice came through again, resolute. "You know I've got your back, Nia. Whatever you need, just say the word." Nia smiled, grateful for the support. "I know, Kay. I appreciate it." They spoke for a few more minutes before hanging up, but even after the call ended, Nia's mind raced with the possibilities of what was to come. She had a plan forming in her mind, but it was still raw, unshaped by the full gravity of the situation. There were legal battles to consider, public statements to craft, and, above all, the need to navigate the media frenzy that would inevitably come with being thrust into the spotlight. As she finally stepped out of the car and walked toward her front door, Nia's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone once again. This time, it was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Nia Robinson." The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, and unmistakably familiar. It took her a second to place it, but when she did, her heart skipped a beat. "Yes, this is Nia." "Who is this?" "This is James Calloway, Deputy Commissioner of the Atlanta Police Department." Nia's grip tightened on the phone. This was unexpected. "Deputy Commissioner," she said, her voice guarded. "What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and when Calloway spoke again, his tone was measured but tense. "I think we need to talk. In person. It's about Officer Mathers." Nia's heart pounded in her chest. She had been prepared for backlash, for pushback from the police department, but not this soon. She hadn't even had time to file the formal complaint yet. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension she felt. Calloway hesitated again, and Nia could tell he was choosing his words carefully. "I've seen the video. And, well, let's just say this is a situation that needs to be handled delicately. Officer Mathers is a complicated case." Nia's eyes narrowed. "Complicated how?" Calloway sighed, the sound heavy over the phone. "He's been with the department for over 10 years. There have been complaints, more than a few. But nothing's ever stuck. He's got connections, Nia. People who have protected him. But after today, that protection might not hold." Nia felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. So Mathers wasn't just another bad cop. He was a protected one. One of those officers who always seemed to slip through the cracks, who faced accusations and investigations, but never faced real consequences. And now, they were coming to her, trying to manage the fallout before it spiraled out of their control. "I'm not interested in protecting Mathers," Nia said, her voice cold. "I'm interested in justice." "I understand that," Calloway replied quickly. "Believe me, I do. But you have to understand that this situation is bigger than just Mathers. If this blows up, and it's already starting to, we could be looking at a much larger problem. Protests, unrest. The city's been through this before, and we can't afford another crisis." Nia clenched her jaw. She knew what he was doing, trying to appeal to her sense of responsibility, trying to make her feel like she was the one who needed to calm things down. But she wasn't going to let him manipulate her into silence. "Deputy Commissioner, with all due respect, the crisis is already here," she said firmly. "And it's not just about Mathers. It's about the entire system that allows officers like him to keep their jobs, even after multiple complaints. It's about the fact that people like me are constantly targeted, harassed, and humiliated by officers who think they're untouchable. If you want to talk, I'm willing to listen, but don't expect me to back down." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Nia wondered if Calloway was about to hang up. But when he spoke again, his tone was softer, more resigned. "Fair enough," he said. "Can you meet with me tomorrow? I think we need to find a way forward that works for both of us." Nia considered the offer for a moment. She didn't trust the police department, not after everything that had happened. But if this meeting could help bring Mathers to justice, or at least expose the corruption that had protected him for so long, it was worth a shot. "I'll meet with you," she agreed. "But understand this. I'm not here to make compromises. I'm here for justice. Calloway's voice was quiet but firm. Understood. I'll send you the details. As the call ended, Naya stood in her driveway, staring at her phone, 1,000 thoughts racing through her mind. This was bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just about Mathers. It was about the entire system. And now, with the world watching, she had the chance to do something about it. But she also knew that the path ahead would be dangerous. Powerful people would be threatened by what she was trying to do, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Nia took a deep breath and walked into her house, her resolve stronger than ever. The real battle was just beginning. Nia sat, her posture rigid, refusing to give an inch. She wasn't here to be placated or soothed with empty promises. She was here to hold him, and the entire department, accountable. Calloway sat across from her, folding his hands on the desk. I understand you're upset about what happened yesterday, and rightfully so. The video has caused quite a stir, and I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. Nia's jaw clenched. She had heard this kind of language before. Vague assurances designed to placate without offering any real commitment to action. She wasn't going to let him off that easily. Taking it seriously. Nia echoed, her voice sharp. That officer, Mathers, has a history of complaints against him. Racial profiling, harassment, excessive force, and yet, he's still on the streets. How seriously have you been taking it before now? Calloway's face tightened, though he kept his tone even. I'm aware of Mathers' record, Ms. Robinson. I've personally reviewed the complaints against him, and while there have been investigations, nothing substantial has come of them. That being said, we are reevaluating his conduct in light of this incident. Reevaluating, Nia repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. Mathers has been protected by this department for years, and now that there's a public outcry, you're suddenly interested in holding him accountable. You had plenty of opportunities to deal with him before it got to this point. Why now? Calloway leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. Because now, it's in the public eye. You know how this works, Ms. Robinson. You're a lawyer. You know that sometimes change only comes when the pressure is applied from the outside. Nia's eyes narrowed. So it's only about optics. About making sure the department looks good in the middle of a PR disaster. Calloway didn't respond right away, his silence speaking volumes. Nia could feel the frustration building inside her. She had seen this too many times. A system that only acted when its image was at stake, not because it cared about the people it was supposed to serve. I'm not here to clean up your department's image, Deputy Commissioner, Nia said coldly. I'm here for justice. Mathers didn't just harass me. He harassed a black woman who drives a nice car. He saw me as a threat because of my skin color, and he treated me like I didn't belong. How many more people has he done this to? How many more complaints are sitting in a file somewhere, gathering dust, while officers like him continue to abuse their power? Calloway's expression hardened, though his voice remained calm. I understand that you're angry. You don't understand anything. Nia shot back, her voice rising. Because if you did, you wouldn't be sitting here, trying to smooth this over with empty promises. This isn't about me being angry. This is about a system that protects officers like Mathers and punishes people like me for daring to stand up for ourselves. For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Calloway sat in silence, his jaw tight, while Nia glared at him, her fists clenched in her lap. She had come here hoping for answers, but all she was getting was more of the same evasive language she had heard for years. Finally, Calloway spoke, his voice softer now, almost resigned. Ms. Robinson, I know the system is flawed. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's not. But change doesn't happen overnight. What happened yesterday, what's happening now, is part of a much larger conversation. I want to work with you to find a solution, but it's going to take time. Nia stared at him, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. I don't have time, Deputy Commissioner. And neither do the people who have been harassed, targeted and brutalized by officers like Mathers. Every day that goes by without action is another day that someone else becomes a victim of this system. Calloway met her gaze, his expression weary. "What do you want, Nia? What can I do, right now, to help?" Nia didn't hesitate. "I want Mathers suspended, immediately, pending a full investigation, not just into what happened yesterday, but into his entire career. I want transparency. I want every complaint that's ever been filed against him to be made public. And I want an independent review board to handle it, not the department." Calloway's eyes widened slightly at the demand. That's a tall order." "It's a necessary one," Nia replied firmly. "If you want to start rebuilding trust with this community, that's where you begin. By showing that officers like Mathers are not above the law. By proving that the department is willing to hold its own accountable." Calloway was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear the decision weighed heavily on him. "I'll do what I can. Mathers will be suspended, effective immediately. As for the investigation, I'll push for an independent review, but that's not entirely within my control. I'll need approval from higher up." Nia nodded, though she didn't feel any sense of victory. This was just the beginning. And the complaints. The public needs to know what kind of officer he is. Calloway hesitated but then nodded again. "I'll release what I can, but you know there are limits on what we can share due to privacy laws." Nia stood, gathering her things, her face expressionless. "You make it happen, or I will. This isn't going away." Calloway rose as well, extending his hand again. This time, Nia took it, though her grip was firm, her eyes hard. "Thank you for your time, Nia. I'll be in touch." As she left the office, Nia felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anger, frustration, exhaustion, but also a small glimmer of hope. She had forced Calloway's hand, had made him take action, even if it was only a small step. But there was still so much work to do. By the time she stepped outside into the midday sun, her phone was buzzing again. Another notification, another news alert. But this one was different. As Nia glanced down at her phone, her heart skipped a beat. Breaking audios. Officer Derek Mathers suspended pending investigation following viral video of confrontation. Nia took a deep breath, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like she had made real progress. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a long, winding road. And today, she had taken the first step. The reckoning had begun.